So what we're going to do now is add some typing into our application, and we're going to start by adding an interface for our activities. And what we'll do, we'll go to our Explorer, and inside the app folder I'm just going to create another new folder and just call it models. And inside this models folder I'm just going to create a new file and call it activity.ts. And inside this file, what I'm going to do is just export an interface, and I'm going to call it iActivity. And conventionally, interfaces typically start with an I. It's not compulsory, but it is kind of conventional. And what we want to do in this interface is describe the structure of our activity object. Now it's going to have an ID, which is going to be of type string. Our title is going to be a string. The description is also going to be a string. The category, once again, is a string. The date is going to be a type of dates. The city will be a string, and the venue will also be a string. And this is the structure of our activity object at this moment. Now, interfaces in Typescript do not appear in the compiled and built JavaScript that we're making here. And when we just want to define the structure of an object, and we want strong typing against this particular object, then interfaces are the way to go. So you might be wondering why I've not used a class here instead of an interface. And a class is really a kind of object factory, a blueprint of what an object is supposed to look like and then implemented. And an interface is a structure used solely for type checking. And the other thing I wanted to point out is if we do create a class, which we can also use for type checking, by the way, this will get transpiled, the class itself will get transpiled into JavaScript, whereas this interface does not. So the actual generated code is a bit shorter when we use an interface. So now that we have an interface, let's make use of it in our application. So I'm just going to head over to app.tsx. And first of all, we want to define the shape of our state object. So above the class itself, I'm just going to add an interface. And I'm going to call it iState. And inside here, we'll define what's inside our state, and it's going to be the activities, which is going to be of type iActivity and an array. And in order to tell our component about this state, if we hover over the component itself, we can see that the component itself can accept a type parameter. And the first type parameter is for the properties that we're receiving in this component. And the second parameter is for the state that we're defining in this component. So we're not actually sending any properties down to our components, but we are defining the state. So I'm just going to add an empty object for our props, and then I'm just going to pass in the iState as the type parameter inside here. What we can do then is tell our state that it's a type of iState. And if we were to attempt to add any additional state properties, and let's just add test and say it's an empty string, we do get an error now because test does not exist in type iState. What we can also do with this particular state property is actually make it read-only. Now, it's never good practice to mutate state directly in a React application, and the only way that we should modify our state is by using the list_setState method. Now, this doesn't make any difference to our code because we're already using list.setState, but if I was to attempt to use this.state equals, then I'll immediately get an error saying that state is a read-only property, and this forces us then to use list.setState instead. So our activities now is a type of an array of iActivity, And if we look at the activities object we're setting inside this.state, well, this has got an any state at this moment. So what we also need to do is tell our Axios method what it's actually going to be returning. Now at the moment it returns an Axios response of type any, but we can define the return property inside here as well, or the return type inside here. And from our get method, what we're actually returning is going to be an array of activities. So what we'll do is we'll say iActivity in here and make it an array. And then if we hover over our activities, we can see that this is now set to the type of iActivity array. And we can see if we hover over the response, this is also now a type of Axios response iActivity array. Now if we scroll further down, what we can do now is take out our any parameter inside here, and if we hover over the activity, then Typescript is smart enough to work out that if we're getting an element from our activities array, then it's going to be of type iActivity. And what this also means that if I attempt to use the name that I did earlier, now this time we are going to get an error because name does not exist on the type of iActivity. And what we'd also find is that our application would simply fail to compile because we're now using a property that doesn't exist on the type that we're using. And what we also get from this, if I just add a period after activity, is we also get better IntelliSense. When we're using our objects that are strongly typed, then we get better IntelliSense and we've got access to the properties that are available on this particular object. And obviously in this case I'm just going to put title back in there. So this is now our app component refactored to use typings. And whilst it does add a little bit of additional code, the end result is typically considered worth it because now our application is a little bit easier to reason about. We can instantly look at our Axios method and we know we're going to get an array of activities back from this. And it also protects us from making silly mistakes or silly typos inside our code as well. So whilst there is a minor piece of short-term pain by adding Typescript, in the long term it does pay off. So what we have so far is a React class component, but this is not the future of how React applications are going to be developed. React is pushing for new projects to make use of React hooks and to not use class components inside React applications. So what we're going to look at next is refactoring our single component to make use of React hooks. And what we're going to do is do the equivalent of what we've done here, but not using a class component and just using React hooks to manage our state and our lifecycle methods. And we'll take a look at that next.